To talk about Syria and the latest developments at the border with Turkey, we're joined from Sydney, Australia by Tim Anderson, an academic in international affairs, someone who's known to be close to the Assad government, or at least has connections there, and can give us insights on what the government's thinking is. Thank you, Tim Anderson, for joining us today.
Thanks, Joe.
CN Live. So, Tim, you've been to Syria twice this year. I don't know what officials, how high up you got to see, but is this a surprise, the developments? It's a surprise for them, if you think. The developments of the last week or so, where Trump initially appeared to have impetuously decided to give a green light to Erdogan, president of Turkey, to invade Syria. And then he turned around and threatened to destroy the economy if they don't do what he says. And now we've gotten a 5-day ceasefire. And the biggest news, of course, is the Kurds have had to form an alliance with the Syrian central government, and the Syrian Arab Army has arrived in Manbij and other important parts of that area, which is a really huge development in the war, Tim.
Yeah, it is a big development, and a lot has turned around in a few days. But I should say, from the Syrian point of view, it's not entirely unexpected because if you go back a few years, the Syrian army has not had serious conflict with the Kurdish militia. Even when the Turkish leadership had moved its agenda into northern Syria. Remember, by far the biggest group and the biggest force behind the Kurdish autonomy is the Turkish group, which have had a very long history with Turkey suppressing their culture and so on. There hasn't been that same sort of problem in Syria. And in Syria, the Syrian army was arming the Kurdish militia against Daesh to start with, basically. It was only with the introduction of the US sponsorship of this separatist project that the relationship began to break down. But there hasn't really been serious conflict in the past between the Syrian Kurds and Damascus.
I'm sorry, who did you say was arming the ISIS?
I said that the Syrian army was arming the Kurds to defend themselves from ISIS. Yeah. Right. So there was cooperation between the Syrian Kurds and the Syrian army, and that was undermined in the first instance by the US occupation.
Well, that's interesting. I don't think that was well known, that there was already some relationship there. But surely the Kurds would not have liked to have made this decision, because they still, I think, had dreams of an independent republic there. Do they lose any chance of autonomy because of this arrangement, or is that something they can still work out?
Look, I think, as I said, the situation in Turkey for the Kurds and the situation in Syria are very, very different, and we have to be aware of that. And there was a Turkish agenda driving this Rojava project, this separatist project in Syria. Certainly they've had to give that up because Damascus is very clear, and indeed Russia supporting Damascus was clear on that point too, that they couldn't. I mean, I think actually there was an attempt, perhaps about a week or 10 days ago, for the separatist militia, which isn't always in sync with the population on the ground there, I might add. And let's bear in mind that the Kurdish people are not a majority in most of these areas that have been claimed. There's a lot of other Syrian people there. But the militia was trying to get the Syrian army to protect them from the Turks without allowing Syria to take over control as the national authority there. In the end, they had to give up that. They had to give up that separatist dream to become part of the Syrian army, basically be incorporated into the Syrian army. And that, of course, also robbed Erdogan of his pretext for invading Syria.
Are you saying that the YPP, the KPP, rather, the Turkish Kurds, were instigators of the independence movement in Syria?
The Turkish Kurd group, the PKK, is the major driver of the separatist project. That's true. Because
they can't succeed in Turkey, I guess.
They wanted a base. I mean, to this extent, President Erdogan has wanted to do their...
I'm sorry, I think we missed that. Could you repeat the last bit?
Yes, the PKK, remember there's 20 million Kurdish people in Turkey and there's about 1.5 million max in Syria. Many of the Syrians were quite happy to be part of a pluralist Syria. Syria, after all, is a state which is very much committed to, very many centuries of being committed to the defense of minorities. Whereas in Turkey, the Kurds had their language repressed, their culture repressed historically since over the last century, basically. Right. So, the Turkish leadership has played a very strong role in the separatist movement in the north of Syria.
Okay, so what happens now with this ceasefire? Apparently this gives a chance for civilians to withdraw, but will the Turkish military operation with their Arab militias that they're backing, will that continue after 5 days?
So this was, of course, it was coming for some time, the conflict between the US and Turkey over the proxies that we're using and how they were seeking to maintain influence in the north of Syria. That tension was coming for some time. It burst over when Trump got his own way effectively with the military industrial complex, as he's recently called it, and moved out. I think what's happening now is, to some extent, the US, but more importantly, Russia, giving Erdogan a chance to climb down out of his tree. He's got up into this idea of having a safe zone and so on, and presenting the PKK base in Syria as a big driver. In reality, of course, he wanted to expand the zone of influence. He wanted a Muslim Brotherhood-aligned group of Syrians, like there is in Idlib, basically, the al-Qaeda groups, the extreme Islamists, to control that part and therefore have that sort of influence in the north of Syria. So I think the US to some extent, and even more so Russia, because it's Russia that now has its troops positioned with the Syrians in many of those northern towns, that's giving Erdogan pause.
Are we looking, I was going to mention, aside from Idlib, are we looking at an end of this 8-year war and the reconstitution of the lost territories of the Syrian government? In other words, hundreds of thousands of people may have died for nothing in this Western and Gulf-backed jihadist attempt at regime change.
Yes, but there's still some uncertainties there, aren't there? I mean, the retreat of US troops from northern Syria is welcome, because that 800-kilometer border with Turkey is a very sensitive issue for the security of Syria and to some extent for Turkey as well. So the resumption of good relationships between Turkey and Syria down the track is very important for ending the war. But let's remember there's also a US occupation in South Syria, in Al-Tanf, which is cutting off the main route to Baghdad. And strategically speaking, in regional terms, the US and Israel have been very focused on the idea of what they call an Iranian land bridge. That is to say, a normal infrastructural link between Tehran, Baghdad, Damascus, Beirut, for example. So the Al-Tanf occupation, the fact that the US is still occupying oil fields on the eastern side of Deir ez-Zor province, for example, that still remains. It's not entirely clear whether Trump's withdrawal is going to, it would be very welcome from the Syrian point of view if they did pull out of Al-Tanf and pull out of east of the Euphrates down near Deir ez-Zor. That is keeping Syria's own oil supply, its power supply for the population from Syria. That's why they've been more dependent on getting oil from Iran, for example. So there are a few things up in the air in terms of whether the US will withdraw from the other parts of Syria.
Are they effectively disrupting supplies from Iran to Hezbollah in Al-Tanf by being deployed there, the US?
They're doing that, but more importantly, they're disrupting supplies to Syria. You remember that tanker that was stopped at Gibraltar eventually got through, basically. I mean, the Syrian population generally is very seriously affected by these sanctions and attempts to blockade energy supplies getting into the country, for example. Hezbollah is only one part of it.
Elizabeth?
Could you give us some perspective on what you see moving forward? I know that Joe already asked is this the end of the war, but whether it is or isn't and how far along that is, to the side for a moment, what do you see moving forward in the more immediate short term in the next few weeks and months?
Well, from the Syrian point of view, their aim has been to liberate the entire country, every inch of the country, as the president said. Let's remember, historically, we've got a 50-year occupation in the south. International law, whatever President Trump said, whatever Mr. Netanyahu said, international law is very clear that's Syrian territory. But Syria, being a small state, has had to proceed step by step in a systematic way. That's why they proceeded with the armed groups in various parts of the country to the point where they've liberated most of the country except in Idlib and those areas which are still occupied. That is to say, Turkey in the north still, the US is still in the southeast and the south, and Israel in the south. So there is a systematic program going on in Syria. They've been gaining in this. Certainly they made some important advances in the first 4 years of the war, but since Russia came in, of course, there's been a systematic, and not just Russia, but Iran also has a strong presence there. since late 2015, there's been steady progress there, only disrupted really by the occupation by four big powers, Turkey, the US and Israel. So I think things are proceeding systematically in that sort of way. We saw some advances in Idlib recently, but the Syrian government has always said, look, we can't say when this war is going to end so long as there is this intervention by foreign powers, which gives shelter to the proxy armies that they've supported. You know, the US was trying to keep so-called SDF control over large swathes of eastern and northeastern Syria, including areas like Raqqa and Manbij, where there were very few Kurdish people anyway. But nevertheless, after ISIS had gone, they used a new proxy there. Down in the south in Al-Tanf, there is still groups of ISIS, groups of other militia which are taking shelter of the US base there, because the US will attack by air any Syrian forces that come near Al-Tanf. So that's the big uncertainty, is the occupation by foreign powers.
What are some of the biggest misrepresentations of these recent events in the media that you've seen from your perspective in the last few weeks, in the last few days especially?
Yeah, I think in the last few days that really there's sort of a bubble debate going on in the US, which is all to do with the fact that people who don't like Trump don't like anything he does and won't give him credit for when he does something actually decent. That is to say, withdraw troops from a foreign occupation. Whatever else you think of Trump, I think you have to give him credit for that. But of course, there's been a big reaction from the Congress, I mean, the majority of the Congress, against the withdrawal. You know, what that means is, you know, pretty shattering, really. You know, does it mean that there's this massive consensus to keep wars going and foreign occupations? On this issue, Trump is completely right. You know, you might disagree with him on everything else, but so there is that discussion going on. Oh, he's thrown the Kurds to the wolves. Well, yes, true. That's true in some sense, but of course it was the US under Bush and then Obama that raised the expectations of separatist groups that they might really be the beneficiaries of some way, but they could only be the beneficiaries if there were a near permanent occupation of those areas. They can't fend for themselves. There's no state in the region that supports a carving up Iraq or Iran or Syria or Turkey. Only Israel supports that, and for rather obvious reasons. It makes Israel look more normal as a racially based state, basically. And I think some of the US officials in their more candid moments admitted this. I think the former US ambassador to Syria, Robert Ford, said to the Kurds, don't trust us, we're going to let you down. They had those sorts of illusions, and that bubble was going to be pricked at some stage, and Trump's done that.
No, I think that's very interesting. I think that's one of the most interesting things watching this development has been the number of voices that maybe you would expect to be anti-war, anti-military industrial complex that have basically said that Trump is abandoning the Kurds and throwing them to the wolves and all of that. So it's been confusing in some ways watching the back and forth where you have people that would never agree with each other on most issues, all in this chorus about Trump abandoning the Kurds. So yeah, it's interesting to get your perspective on that.
I suppose one exception in terms of US politics has been Tulsi Gabbard. Tulsi Gabbard has stepped out of the factional or the party debate to make a clear point about that issue, at least.
Yeah, definitely. Joe?
Well, there is a consensus to keep wars and occupation going. And and Trump is not someone that they like for disrupting that, whatever his motives. Now, just to follow up on Elizabeth's first question about what you see in the short term here, will the Turks still try to create this safe zone, which ironically Hillary Clinton wanted? Is Trump going to allow the Turks to create the safe zone that his opponent Hillary Clinton wanted?
I think in relation to, as I said before, in relation to the South, it's less clear because there's still the obsession that Trump shares about the role of the influence of Iran in the region. And of course, this has a bearing on Iraq too, doesn't it? All of the expense and the investment that the US has made in trying to have Iraq as a weak client state is up for grabs if the relationship between Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and for that matter, Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is effectively the major power in the Lebanese government, if that strengthens, and it is strengthening. This is the dilemma for US intervention in the entire region. That failure in Syria means that their investment in Iraq is also up for grabs, basically. But the safe zone in Turkey, I think that's, if the Kurdish militia are incorporated into the Syrian army, the pretext that Erdogan is using at the moment disappears. Now, Erdogan is a very difficult person. Damascus doesn't talk to him at all because President Assad thinks he's mad. Nevertheless, Russia and Iran talk to Erdogan, and to some extent they've been boxing him in and committing him to the letter of, for example, the Astana agreements in terms of defending the territorial integrity of Syria, not trying to carve it up and so on. So there are some powerful friends that Syria has there to really, in the first instance, stop a escalating war between Syria and Turkey, and then after that to try and make some sort of settlement in the north there. The east and the southeast, the relationship between the normal channels and the communications, trade is open between Iraq and Syria, but the US is still down there. The US is still sitting on oil fields. The US is still trying to obstruct that normal constructive relationship between neighbors down there.
I'm not sure trade ever was disrupted. I bought Aleppo soap in Erbil in Iraq a couple of years ago. Surprised to know that. So Erdogan's going to be stuck with the refugees. I mean, this is a domestic political issue for him as well, and an economic one. But he wanted to do it in a completely illegal way in terms of international humanitarian law, refugee law, which was not to force refugees back into their country. But he wants this safe zone to drive the refugees out of Turkey back into Syria. With the Syrian Arab army and the Russians there now, what happens to that plan?
The Syrians, of course, are not posing an obstacle to that, but what Erdogan's plan was not just to allow or force the refugees back, but to have an administration there, a jihadist administration effectively, that is controlling that region and then having people under that sort of regime. I mean, really what he is trying to do is extend the Idlib model across the whole of North Syria, basically. A number of refugees did go back after Aleppo was liberated. You might recall that there was something like really the biggest influx of or return of refugees at that time, something in the order of 600, 700,000 went back to Aleppo very, very quickly in that first year in 2017. There's still a lot in Turkey, but of course, this has been a card that Erdogan has been playing. He's been playing it with the Europeans very, very blatantly. He got a lot of money out of them back in 2015, 2016. He's trying to play the card again, but the security management of that border is very important. On the one hand, the refugees have been blocked from going back by the war and also by the Turkish authorities. On the other hand, there's been this free flow of international jihadists to keep the destabilization going in northern Syria. So it's a long border, and the normalization of that border, at some stage there has to be a relationship between neighbors, between Ankara and Damascus. There has to be down the track some relationship to manage that.
I don't see that happening if the jihadists still are in control in Idlib, and if they take control along the Turkish border inside Syria. So, I mean, how long can they be contained, and for how long could that go on? Is that sustainable? I also wanted to point out, I just remembered that the Russians told the Syrians early on when they first intervened that they would forget about the idea of taking back every inch of Syria. Do you remember when they told them that? When you look in the current context now, are the Russians saying that we've got to hold back on Idlib because there's been some offensives, but they've stopped? How is that going to resolve itself in Idlib? How long can we go on with the jihadists running that province?
The Syrians have been very clear they're going to take back every inch, and that includes Idlib, includes the Jolan, and the Russians have not seriously contradicted that, in my view. They've said, for example, in relation to the Jolan, which is a harder issue for them than Idlib, it is much harder. They've made some strong statements about Idlib, but in relation to the Jolan, they have not contradicted the Syrians, but there's an expectation, I guess, that the Russians may not be supporting them in doing that because of Russia's relationship with Israel. And there's been some public statements about this, including from the Hezbollah leader, that they know that Russia is a strong ally in Syria, in Idlib, but when it comes to Israel, that's a different story. So I think there's been quite a polarized debate about Russia's role and its relationship with Israel here. But I think the better, some people are saying that Russia is stabbing Syria in the back because of its relationship with Israel. Some are saying Russia is saving Syria. I think that neither of those extremes are right in this situation. But I think the Russians in recent months have made very clear statements about Idlib, that they are in there to get rid of terrorism in all of Syria and return Idlib to control by the Syrian government. And they're doing the same thing now in Manbij and in Kobani too, in Ain al-Arab at the moment. So I think the Russians are committed to Idlib, but they've been doing it in stages because, remember, there's been this diplomatic game, which is a very important game, the Astana process, and a series of ceasefires in Idlib, which are, of course, a mixed blessing in a sense, in the sense that on the one hand, it's important to explore all the possibilities of a peaceful resolution there. On the other hand, they can't allow the Al-Qaeda groups to keep undermining that. They don't respect the ceasefires. They attack people in surrounding Idlib and Aleppo and Latakia, for example, Hama in the past. So I think the Russians have shown in words and in practice that they are committed to liberating Idlib. But as you say, it's a difficult situation so long as there is this political will in Ankara to keep destabilizing. That's a very big thorny question, because your neighbors don't go away. The US may withdraw, but the neighbors don't go away.
Well, I don't think Erdogan would want another influx of refugees from Idlib into Turkey. Is there any chance of direct clashes between Turkish troops, or at least their Arab militia, and the Syrian Arab army? Has that started?
Yes, there has been some, but not a lot. There's been some artillery exchange in the north there, but both sides are pretty keen and mediated by Russia, let's remember, because remember the Russian president invited Erdogan to, I think, to Moscow for talks, and that's going to happen very shortly. I think after he just spoke with Pence, the US vice president, he's going to talk to Putin, and they've been on the phone already. So I think Russia is mediating that. They are sitting up there. They have a presence on the ground around north of Manbij, for example. Yes, I think that there is, and the US has announced this ceasefire they're talking about at the moment. I really think that from all sides there are messages. It's not that important the Trumps talk about sanctions and so on, I don't think, because Erdogan is using that as a card, an anti-American card for domestic politics. It's not terribly influential on him, but I think the Russian role is much more influential.
And he said, Erdogan said that he threw Trump's letter in the bin, which I thought was quite amusing. But this could be a humiliation for him if this gambit turns out to be a dud. I mean, if he has to withdraw, doesn't get what he went in to do.
Yes, that's true. But so long as he's going after, he's inflaming it, including the anti-Washington stuff, precisely because that helps him domestically. He's getting some benefit from that domestically, and going after the PKK, he's getting some benefit from that domestically too. But yes, there are downsides to it too. Not least the what you talked about, people, refugees. But in this case, in Idlib, we're talking about a very large percentage of the population in northern Idlib is now linked to those Al-Qaeda groups, basically. And so that in itself poses a threat to Turkey. And there have been protests on the border of Idlib and Turkey when they've closed the border to those people trying to get through, for example, when the Syrians and the Russians were pushing them in South Idlib, basically. So they're to Ankara for what's going on in Idlib.
Now, I hate to ask you to speculate here, but I would like to just get your perspective for a moment on what could have motivated Trump to do this now, if you have an opinion on that. So, and I'm not asking you to say, what was he thinking, what exactly is his intention, but what are some of the impetus, some of the things that could have gone into, pushing him to make this decision or to announce this now, rather than 3 months ago, 6 months from now, etc.
Well, it's a difficult thing to say that Trump's consistent on anything, really, but you have to, in a sense, join the dots, don't you, between what he said in the election campaign in 2016 what he said late last year, I think December last year, about a withdrawal from troops, and what he's saying in the last few days, where he not only talks about a withdrawal from Syria, he goes and makes some of these broader points, you know, about his battle with the military-industrial complex and so on, and him getting the upper hand in certain areas and so on. And some other reports we've got on the ground from the fact that there was, you know, some sort of near mutiny going on with this process in Syria itself. So that we've known for some time there's an internal struggle in Washington about this whole process, but on this issue at least, there seems to be some consistency. If you look 2016, 2018, 2019, Trump is doing something he promised he was going to do, and he's expanding on. He's giving, you know, you don't want to take his words too seriously because he's a terrible narcissist and says that he's responsible for everything good in the world. But nevertheless, there is a thread that runs from 2016 to this week, which says he does believe that it's a losing war, it's a wasteful war, that the US has no business being there. But as I said before, the problem for that is that the US has a lot of baggage in the Middle East. It's got a series of new Middle East wars. It has a supposed influence in Iraq, which is trying to contain the influence of Iran, because Iran is the major sponsor of the resistance in Palestine, and including Hezbollah, including Syria. So the whole region is at stake, and that's probably why the intensity of the internal struggle within what they call the deep state, or you might say, as Trump recently repeated, the military-industrial complex, the people want to keep these wars going.
And the last thing I'll ask before I hand it back to Joe is just to ask: do you think that the removal of John Bolton from you know, his role in the Trump administration had anything to do with this, or not?
I myself don't think that's too important, because Trump is a person who, he has his own style, and that is hiring and firing people and getting different perspectives and so on, and also talking things up and then talking things down and trying to cut a deal and so on. So I think that, you know, Bolton to me was another person who was there who prevented attacks on Trump from a certain section of US politics by the fact that him being there. I don't think in itself it's that important, but certainly there is this you know, internal chess game going on, which is important in terms of what the outcome's going to be. Maybe Trump has consolidated his influence within the administration to the point where he can do this, and facing a lot of opposition, a lot of tension with Turkey over the last couple of years. But I think the internal struggle is important. I don't think Bolton was that important.
Tim, a couple of things before I ask you about your trips to Damascus. Is the UN side of this diplomacy dead? I mean, they had a Geneva process, and now you mentioned the Astana process several times, but you haven't mentioned the UN. Has that just completely been sidelined?
To some extent, but there's still a representative, a Secretary General representative involved, and effectively the UN process has ended up backing the Astana process. So it's sort of been collapsed to some extent into the Astana process. And what it means is that Russia diplomatically took the lead there, basically, and it's joined in the big neighbors, you know, the Turkey and Iran there. So basically the US lost the diplomatic game in that respect. But it doesn't mean the UN's entirely out of the picture, because the UN is involved in this, you know, the construction of a constituent assembly, if you like, or a committee to formulate a new Syrian constitution. That side of the political process the US is linked into.
How do the officials in Damascus feel about a new constitution and the UN writing it? I remember in Egypt, after the fall of Mubarak, there was some talk at the UN about helping the Egyptians, and they were incensed by this, that foreigners would have to get involved. But they had a long tradition, legal tradition there. They had good enough lawyers and smart enough people to write their own constitution. Yes,
well, the short answer is that the UN's not writing it, basically, nor is the UN selecting the people for it. There has been a type of a struggle over that. The US, of course, has wanted that the big powers have a say in who is selected onto this commission. Even Russia, to a certain extent, has had a tension with Syria over that. But the Syrians have well, they remember they're at the core of the resistance of defending their country here, and they have maintained a very strong hand in what's going to happen with the selection process. For example, a debate has gone on for some years about whether the UN is actually creating this commission or whether the UN is facilitating the Syrians to do it. And so the language of Syrian driven and so on has got into all of those resolutions. And the Syrians have enough political will to say more than, say, the Iraqis did when the similar sort of process happened in Iraq, that they're very alive to the fact that who is on that commission, how the new constitution is going to be framed, is not going to escape their hands, basically, even if Russia puts a bit of pressure on them. Russia so far has, in a number of respects, made some suggestions and then pulled back when the Syrians have said, no, we don't want to do this, for example. So there is a bit of a tussle going on at that level.
But Assad and his closest advisors have accepted that they need a new constitution, which I think is also surprising. Why wouldn't? What are is they doing this for international goodwill? Do they feel they have to make some kind of reforms after all of this, or
both?
Or do they really want to? Are there real changes needed to make it more democratic? Okay,
it's both in a way. For example, there are residual, let's say, Islamist elements in the Syrian constitution, which were put there as a sop to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Syrian president must be a Muslim, for example. Hafez al-Assad didn't want that, actually, but and in fact there are some, let's say, more secular forces in Syria that want to get rid of it. So there are some and there was a constitutional reform in 2012, remember, which removed the Ba'ath monopoly from the Syrian system. One of the major demands of political reform process of 2011, by the way. So there are some other areas that the Ba'ath Party, which is still in power, and others want change. So, the Syrians will use, but on the other hand, there's also the diplomatic side of it, that in a sense that there's being seen to give a wider voice in the construction or the reconstruction or the reform of the constitution is seen as helpful for stabilizing the country, basically.
Now, there was a reform movement, I think, in 2008, around that time, and it didn't really go as far as it probably could have. Was that a mistake? Could Assad have done more there to try to stave off the initial uprisings, which led to the internationalization of the war?
Yeah, I mean, well, that's arguable. There was indeed a very powerful consensus in 2005, something called the Damascus Declaration, that was created, a document which was very powerfully critical of the Ba'ath Party, of cronyism, corruption, and so on, signed by pretty much all the parties except the Muslim Brotherhood, which was banned still at that time. Some of the Kurdish militia had an ambiguous position on it. But one of the things that Damascus Declaration said, for all that it was very scathingly critical of the Syrian government at that time, was that they rejected the idea of a tax on the state or a tax on the army, and then rejected the idea of foreign intervention. So that was built very strongly into the Damascus Declaration. Along comes 2011, you've got a genuine political foment, which was paralleled by a Salafist insurrection, basically, which took cover under that and drove the demonstrators off the street, basically. We should remember that in 2011, 2012, Assad actually gave in to a lot of those demands effectively. He disciplined the governor of Daraa for how he dealt with the protests. There was a constitutional referendum in early 2012, which the main change of which was to remove the Ba'ath Party monopoly. So there has been and the state of emergency was withdrawn during a state of war. So there have been a number of changes there, and the government itself has. There were some other ministers in the government came in from some other parties, some non-party people and some party people. There was a type of a coalition government formed in 2012 with the Ministry of Reconciliation and so on, which is now gone because for other reasons. So there has been a process of political accommodation at that time. I think it's, of course, in the West, the problem is that there was this illusion that Assad was somehow impermeable to any sort of reform proposals. And what happened was basically the Salafist insurrection backed by international jihadists, drove all of the political reform process off the streets. And people who were in the political reform process in those first few weeks and months of 2011 have said to me from early days that they resent the fact that the international media keeps talking about the Al-Qaeda, Muslim Brotherhood, jihadist armed groups as representing the opposition. You know, these are people who were in the Damascus Declaration, who were in the political reform process for decades before.
Well, it's interesting because I was going to ask you, had there not been this Salafist uprising backed by foreign powers, mostly from the Gulf originally, could that reform process have succeeded and prevented a war?
Well, I mean, there are many people who say, look, Assad agreed to most of the reform demands back at that time, but it did nothing to change the Salafist insurrection.
Right.
So
if they weren't there, it may have worked. We'll never know. Obviously, we'll never know whether that would have been the case. But I'm really interested in that early period because there are people to this day, particularly here in the U.S., who think they know what they're talking about in Syria, who still see this as some popular in the street uprising against the government. He's just slaughtering his own people. Now, many of the people that the Arab army has killed are foreigners, so he's not killing his own people so much, or as many, or only, but many foreign fighters from across the Muslim world who've gone there to fight.
That's true.
That early part of the war there is so important because from the very beginning, you're saying, just days really from that Dara uprising, right? The students who wrote on the wall. It didn't take long. Were these Syrians at first? Were these Muslim Brotherhood activists at the beginning? And then how soon after that did Gulf money start coming in backing foreign fighters?
No, the Gulf money came in from the beginning. I mean, they intercepted a shipment of arms from the Saudis through Al-Tanf, from Iraq, on, I think it was March the 11th, before the insurrection took place. And the arms that were accumulated at the Al-Amari Mosque in Dara came from the Saudis at that time. So the Salafists were, because this was coming for some time, basically, it was being prepared. The tunnels in Idlib, the route from Idlib into Aleppo, for example, was anticipated too. Some of the tunnels were being prepared for years in advance, really. So the fact that there was a reformist movement in early 2011, as I say, it was really, there were two things going on at once, basically. So that period is interesting, as you say, because also the extent of the violence in the early weeks of the insurrection was played down by both sides. This is a point that Sharmin Nawani made in some of her articles, that the government wanted to play down the killing of soldiers in March and April 2011, and the other side did too, because they were saying it was peaceful protesters for the first 6 months. That was the Human Rights Watch line, basically. But I mean, the whole theme of Assad killing his own people was a very powerful meme that was driven through the whole process, the reason for the intervention, basically. The best answer to it is to see the opinion polls all through the war. Basically, Assad increased his population amongst the Syrian people during that war. And it isn't just the Syrian polls you look at, because Turkey and Qatar and NATO consultants did their own surveys of this too, and they all came to the same conclusion. Assad remained very popular. So all of the stories about targeting schools, targeting hospitals, killing his own people, you have to put that against the fact that Assad is far more popular in his own country than most of the leaders who are against him. Erdogan in his country, all of the US presidents in their own country, for example.
Well, if anyone, and at the beginning, I certainly thought that there was a lot more democracy that could be had in Syria. But once ISIS was established, particularly, that did it for me in terms of saying that the best outcome is for Damascus to win this war. Because, I mean, Assad has never threatened Europe. He's not even threatened Israel. I mean, his father and himself talked about the Golan Heights, but there really hasn't been any action on that. There's a lot of rhetoric on that, but I don't know if Israel ever felt threatened from Syria about that. So Assad is still the better choice, even if you look at it as a lesser of two evils, than this collection of extremists. You've supported Assad from day one, haven't you?
I supported the Syrian people's right to self-determination. That was the principle I came in on. And within a fairly short period of time, I realized that the Syrian army and Assad certainly had very, very strong support there, very, very strong support on the ground. In fact, first time I went to Syria in 2013, I heard criticism of President Assad, but it wasn't the Western criticism. They called him Mr. Soft Heart. They were worried that he wasn't as hard a man as his father. And they thought that he was, for example, he disarmed the police that went along to some of the early rallies in Idlib, for example. And as a result, the police were killed by the Salafists, you know. So that was one thing. And then back to your question, Joe.
And my question was whether you supported the Assad government from the beginning, or did you later?
Oh, yeah.
You said you supported the Syrian people, not necessarily the
I
government.
support the Syrian people, the right of the Syrian people to self-determination, which is the case in any foreign intervention, basically. It's the essential principle. What I was going to say about Assad was that there was criticism, worry that he was too soft to handle this sort of crisis. And then I remember hearing in 2013 when the Geneva talks started, maybe in 2012 when they started, but in 2013, there was this suggestion from a Syrian vice minister that I heard that they legalize the Muslim Brotherhood. Maybe a step there was to legalize, because the Muslim Brotherhood was the major internal domestic enemy, effectively involved with the Salafist insurrection. And when I passed that idea back to some people who were very pro-government, they said, "We will be against Assad. We will be against Assad if he legalizes the Muslim Brotherhood. Why are we fighting this war if not against these people," basically? So it wasn't something that came to fruition in Geneva, but there was a very strong reaction from people to the idea that they would actually legalize the Muslim Brotherhood. And if Assad was going to do that, they would have opposed Assad in doing it.
What happened to the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria? Because once the war really started getting going, at least in the Western coverage, you never heard this mentioned. Now, these guys were fighting in various other jihadist groups. They weren't fighting as a movement, as their own movement, were they?
No, that's true. But the first big group, what were they called again? The brigade that was in Homs, basically, Farouk Brigade. The Farouk Brigade were effectively, the next generation of Muslim Brotherhood after the Hama insurrection. Now, the Hama insurrection has its own mythology associated with it too, but there was a continuity there, that there was a insurrection in Hama in 1982, which was very similar to the insurrection in Dara. That is to say, it began with rooftop snipers and so on to bring in the security forces, claim that civilians were victims and so on. There's a mythology around that. So the Muslim Brotherhood, the Farouk Brigade was effectively defeated in 2012, and then the big influx of foreign fighters began to come in from Turkey, to some extent Lebanon, but from Turkey. And then they tried to recreate a domestic Syrian Muslim Brotherhood group in the name of Ara al-Sham for quite some time. And then Jaish al-Islam, for example. So these groups there was many of them, and some of them were bigger and more influential. I mentioned the bigger ones, basically. But there's a long history of that in Syria, and that is the domestic side of things, which you can't discount. It's true there were probably hundreds of thousands of foreigners who went to Syria, including their families and all the rest of the baggage that came with them and so on. But there were large groups of, let's say, Salafists linked to the Muslim Brotherhood, and mercenaries who were hired on top of that, a lot of less educated country boys, for example. Going back to that 2013, when the suggestion was that the Muslim Brotherhood perhaps be legalized, the thought was there that in peacetime, the Muslim Brotherhood could have had support of up to 15% of the population. But in a wartime, when it emerged that there was a real conflict, and the choice was between the government and the Salafist groups, that support would shrink back down to perhaps something like 5 or 6%, something like that. Indeed, that's what a Turkish poll showed in late 2011, that TESEV, a Turkish group, did a poll in late 2011, published in 2012, and they found that 5% of the population supported the violent attacks on the government at that time. So that was from Turkey.
I'm sorry, as in Egypt, they broke with some of the violent jihadists of the 80s, for example, and more or less renounced violence. Did that ever happen in Syria? Was there a section, at least of the Muslim Brotherhood leadership, who have never supported joining any of these other groups and using violence?
The Muslim Brotherhood was a political network, underground political network, and there were periods when they were quiescent, let's say. If you look at Salafism, because it has a religious doctrine there have been non-violent Salafists. They were very sectarian, but they weren't violent. The Muslim Brotherhood essentially was about power. It was about a network of power. So they always wanted power in some form. They were banned most of the time in Egypt, most of the time in Syria. And so their history has been effectively And then, of course, we have to remember that the fact that they got funding from the Gulf monarchies, and particularly the Saudis, created that alliance between Wahhabism and Muslim Brotherhood. There's still that tension between Wahhabism and Muslim Brotherhood. That effectively drove them into this sectarian violence, basically, Saudi-style violence. There are these differences which you see with the attacks that Saudi Arabia made on Qatar, for example, which is really the base of which is, the jealousy that the Saudis have to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a much wider network, in Turkey, in Egypt, in Qatar, and so on. But nevertheless, the alliance, for most of the time, between the Saudi Arabian Wahhabis and the Muslim Brotherhood drove it into much more of a consistent pattern of violence.
It's interesting because they're not particularly fond of the Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia, particularly in the UAE. But Elizabeth asked a really good question before about the misrepresentations in the Western media about Syria in general. There's a couple that I want to point out and want to know what you think. One, when Putin came to the UN, and I was there at the UN headquarters that day, and he made this extraordinary speech in which he offered to the United States to join with Russia, as the Soviet Union and the US did against the Nazis, to fight ISIS, to come together. That it was not going to be he didn't want a necessarily unilateral Russian intervention that was invited by the Syrian government, that he wanted the US to take part. And yet, that was never really reported. Instead, we heard this isn't a chance for Russia to regain its imperial glory in the Middle East. This is the way it was framed. A bunch of imperialists here in the US could only project onto Russia imperialist motives, not to actually fight an extremely dangerous group that was allowed to grow by the US, by the Gulf, as we know from a leaked DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency document from August 2012, that this group was forming in eastern Syria, and Obama administration did sweet FA about that. They did nothing to stop that. And then we have the John Kerry leaked tape when he was talking to some Syrian exiles in New York on the sidelines of the General Assembly of years, in which he said that we saw ISIS advancing towards Damascus, and we were watching and waiting, hoping they would put pressure on Assad to leave. So they were not fighting ISIS there. And here you have Trump claiming victory of ISIS, when everybody who knows anything about this war knows that it's been the Russians, the Iranians, Hezbollah, and Iraqi militias that have defeated ISIS, not the US, and the Kurds fighting for the US. These are just some of the ridiculous things. And on the debate stage here in the US for the Democratic Party Tuesday night, we heard some of the most extraordinary and deluded things. For example, Tulsi Gabbard said the truth, which was that the US had a regime change war in Syria. And of course, Joe Biden said it was untrue. And this was a bald-faced lie. So, I mean, I'm frustrated because I'm in the media, and I was in the corporate mainstream media for many, many years, and I'm happy to be out of it and running Consortium News. But this is a real issue. How do you break through to get real information to people about the complexity of the Syrian war and the U.S. role in it?
Well, of course, speaking of Joe Biden, he in 2014 made admissions that all his close allies were in fact supporting all of the jihadist groups, from Jabhat al-Nusra, HTS, whatever, to ISIL, that the Saudis and Turkey and the others were supporting them. So he admitted that. Let's remember also that going back to the roots of ISIS, we have to go back further than Syria. We have to go back to Iraq, because in 2006, when Condoleezza Rice was announcing the new Middle East wars, at the beginning of the new the coherence of the new Middle East wars, let's say, that was the time when Seymour Hersh published that article, The Redirection, about the plan of Washington precisely to inflame a Sunni Shia division and try and weaken Baghdad in particular. Baghdad was the ISI, the Islamic State in Iraq, before it became the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant. That was 2006, 2007, when major Shia mosques were being bombed in Iraq. So it was used to try and stop Baghdad getting close to Tehran back then, 12, 13 years ago. And then it was re-weaponized, as you pointed out, in early 2012, in 2012, 2013, to move across into Syria for the same thing, as the DIA report I think you referred to mentioned, that it was about isolating and weakening Damascus, and that the US was very happy with the idea of a caliphate, a Salafi caliphate.
Salaf Principality is what it was called in that document. Later a caliphate, yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you about, but first, one more question about Idlib. And Elizabeth, if you want to join in, because I want to talk about life in Damascus now in this war. I remember when Aleppo finally was regained by the Syrians with Russian help, they put a lot of these jihadists on buses with their families and sent them to Idlib. It's like, I thought at that moment they're concentrating them in Idlib, and then there's going to have to be maybe the final showdown there. Was that the idea? And how can you have this showdown without avoiding massive civilian casualties, like we saw in Mosul, like we saw in Raqqa, for example?
Yes, well, I think that the reason is, and the reason why, contrary to the Western mythology of making Assad as some monster, you know, the new Hitler, was that they were really trying to avoid bloodshed. Rather than have a fight to the finish in a lot of areas, you know, the East Ghouta, for example, and Aleppo, and which would have caused a huge amount of bloodshed, they gave a way out. And not everyone was happy with that. Not everyone was happy with some of these people who'd committed terrible crimes being effectively given a second chance. But nevertheless, it was trying to avoid bloodshed. And of course, the problem of wide-scale bloodshed in having future reconciliation, that was spoken of in Syria from very early days. You know, they had to limit the bloodshed to try and limit the extent of bitterness and the ongoing problem they had to deal with in the future in terms of what they called a Musalaha reconciliation process. So yes, they were concentrating them in Idlib from a number of different areas, from the south, from East Ghouta, from Aleppo, from Hama, for example. But you know, and it's created a situation where they have to come to a final showdown. There's no more green buses. There is still the process, at least for Syrians, to have a what do they call it? Having their legal affairs regularized in some sort of ways. They've done that in a lot of areas. For example, in the south, down around Dara Kanatra, in East Ghouta, they have, in East Ghouta, for example, about 80 months ago, I was there, and was it? No, it must have been last year sometime. Yeah, 80 months ago last year. That Failaq al-Rahman, which is one of the Islamist groups working with Jabal al-Nusra in the East Ghouta, 1,200 of them had agreed to a reconciliation process through their sheikhs and had joined the Syrian army. So on the checkpoints in the East Ghouta, government-controlled East Ghouta, you have these wild-eyed guys with wild hair and beards and so on who've been taking Captagon amphetamines for years, actually on Syrian army checkpoints. And, you know, a lot of people are not very happy with this. There are people who fought on the side of the jihadists for years who are now roaming around, you know, apparently free and to some extent incorporated into the Syrian army. It's a very imperfect situation, you know, but it's something that the Syrians have done to try and resolve the conflict and limit the bloodshed in the first instance. What you have in Idlib now is the hardcore who refuse all of those sorts of offers, and either they're going to escape into Turkey or into Europe or fight to the death. That's what seems to be going on there.
I went to Damascus once in March 2011, believe it or not, just a few weeks before the uprising began, and in the lobby of my hotel, I was watching Al Arabiya, and they were showing scenes of fighting in the streets of Tripoli, and uprisings and trouble in Libya. And I was wondering why they would show this. I'm thinking good that they did. I'm all for freedom of information, obviously, but why the Syrian government would allow the Syrian people to see this? Would it give them some ideas if this so-called Arab Spring was spreading? It could spread to their country. Was Assad too confident in his control of power at that point?
Well, there was a lot of openness in Syria at that time, and to some extent there still is, but probably I don't know that Al Arabiya is still in the country in that way. Certainly Al Jazeera got kicked out. But I have to say that amongst my friends at that time in March, and for the few months, maybe at least 3 months after that, Al Jazeera was watched in Damascus. In fact, a lot of you refer to the Syrian stations, for example, because it seemed to be more open and more cosmopolitan and so on. But on the other hand, you had Al Jazeera in particular, you know, the Qatari station. Al Arabiya was Saudi's way of trying to play catch up with Al Jazeera, because Al Jazeera was doing it better, basically. But Al Jazeera was also showing these supposed rallies put down by the police, and people would look at it and say, look out their window and go and say, just a minute, this isn't exactly right. So there was a very rapid crash in the credibility of Al Jazeera, for example, in 2011. And of course, you know, the feeling in terms of the role the Saudis have played is very strong in Syria. Of course, I don't think the Saudis. Apparently, the Emirates are back in there to some degree, you know, and with some investments. But and maybe they've reopened their embassy there. But the bitterness at the role of the Saudis and also Qatar is very strong still in Damascus.
What is life like right now in Damascus? The last time you were there, and how do you get there? Do you have to fly to? Where do you fly in from? Amman? Where's their flight?
You can fly in from the Gulf, from Dubai on Syrian air, but the easiest way is to get in is just to drive in from Beirut. Basically, there's
right.
You can get taxi or a couple of taxis from Beirut. It's only about 3 hours from Beirut to Damascus. Damascus is very tranquil now since what's the beginning of last year, beginning of 2018, when they liberated East Ghouta and Douma. I visited Douma a few months after that, and there was a sort of a normalization going with it, with some of those problems that I mentioned. There are still some sleeper cells and so on, but there have been no. First of all, the jihadists never really controlled the old city or most of Damascus, unlike Aleppo. It's mainly the East Ghouta, the eastern rural green belt that they were in. And there were some old parts that they ransacked and so on there, but they were firing in mortars from East Ghouta into the old city for quite a long time. You know, there are still shrapnel marks on the asphalt on the roads, in the bus stop at Bab Tuma and so on in the Christian area of the East Old City. But it's very peaceful now. In the last 18 months, it's been very peaceful, and the old city wasn't seriously damaged. A lot of people died as a result of attacks in the past, but there are no terrorist attacks in Damascus anymore. It's starting to recover its normality. It has been gradually over a number of years, I might add, because the strange thing about a war, you probably know, is that somehow people, after years, get used to certain things in a strange sort of way. They get used to this. School children get used to the fact that there's going to be a shell or a missile every now and then. Anyway, that's all gone now, but there's a sense of normality in Damascus, certainly.
So no new holes in the roof, in the corrugated iron roof of the old souk. And those holes are up there from the French, who I think in 1925 fired from their airplanes right through the tin roof, down on people inside the souk. It's an amazing thing to look up and see the sunlight coming through those holes. So there was no damage there. Yeah, that's still there.
But there were some bombings around there because there are some Shia shrines around there. There were some bombings. There's still tight security around the Shia shrines, but the checkpoints in general are more relaxed in Damascus. So when you come to the souks in Aleppo and Homs, that's different, of course. They've reconstructed the souk in Homs completely with a new roof, with a lot of new materials, keeping some of the old style. But the one in Damascus you mentioned is still as is.
So there's an economy there. I mean, people are in cafes and restaurants. There's life as normal there. You wouldn't know there was a war going on pretty much now?
It is, except for the fact that you've got this economic war going on, and you do have very low salaries and very high prices and a lot of shortages, so the economic war, which is very, very intense, you can't use any sort of credit card there. The banking system for foreigners doesn't work at all. You have to take cash in there. There's shortages, there's high prices for things. So that economic war is certainly hurting people. And of course, it's affecting the health system. It's affecting a lot of things. Fuel, the shortages of fuel, there's still rationing of fuel. There's that economic war is still going on.
And despite that, he's still popular outside, you're saying?
Yes, he's seen as he and Putin and Nasrallah and the Iranians. They're seen as great heroes, basically great resistance heroes, because everyone knows very well that Syria is a very small country, and it's had very big powers ranged against it.
No, when I was there, they were strategically placed, photos of Bashar and photos of Hafez, his father, everywhere you go. And I wonder, is there any chance for some kind of multi-party democracy in Syria, or is that a pipe dream?
Well, the multi-parties have been there for some time, but the history of assassinations and so on. In the parliament, there are multi-parties. There was the first in 2014, 5 years ago. There was the first multi-candidate presidential election as opposed to a plebiscite. So they're moving in that sort of direction. One interesting thing was that if you looked at the National Assembly elections in 2012 and 2016, the Ba'ath Party, since its monopoly on power was effectively written out of the Constitution, increased its vote. despite the dissatisfaction with cronyism and corruption and so on in the Ba'ath Party, nevertheless, they went from something like 52% of the vote to 60% of the vote in the National Assembly in 2016. So, there is that process which is going to be enhanced, I guess, by this constitutional committee.
Now, how many times have you met Bashar al-Assad? Now, you mentioned Tulsi Gabbard earlier. She has called him a brutal dictator. But as you also mentioned, these guys were put on buses, not lined up against the wall, and shot to take care of this problem right away, which a brutal dictator probably would do without any problem, like Saddam Hussein. He's not Saddam Hussein.
No, and he never was. Never was. It's an extraordinary achievement, really, of the humanitarian war team, particularly in the US, I guess, but to some extent in Europe, that they painted this guy who was, before the war and still is really, in my view, a mild-mannered eye doctor who was very concerned about the psychological damage on children and the impact on their culture and so on. That's why they called him Mr. Softheart. That's why there was some hesitance in supporting him in the early days, because they thought that he wouldn't have a firm hand, for example. But you're right that the characterization was quite false, but also really a remarkable achievement in terms of modern propaganda. I think the British ambassador, for example, recently said, "We are in Syria because Assad is killing his own people." But Adolf Hitler didn't kill his own people either, really. Not people he considered as patriotic Germans. He killed people who he considered as non-Germans,
Well, except the ones he sent to the Russian front, but that's another thing. He had a lot of them killed. But I mean, let's not paint too rosy a picture. No government is perfect, and certainly this is not a system that is in a European tradition of having multi-parties and the kind of political campaigns that we're used to. Maybe that's not something that the Syrians want. I don't know. I'm not speaking for them. But there is a police state there. There is the Muhabarat, which is very strong and was way before the war began. There was definitely displeasure with the government by lots of people.
Yes, and he admitted that to us when we first met him in 2013. He knew that a very large proportion of people didn't like the government. Of course, his popularity, because he was also credited, remember, with opening up the economy and removing some of the restrictions on the economy and introducing the internet and so on, his popularity has always sat higher than the Ba'ath Party. I would say the army's popularity sits higher than even him too, but he's the commander-in-chief of the army. So you're right that the Mukhabarat, the secret police, were feared by a lot of people. I've got friends who were arrested and detained by them and so on. I've seen them in action myself, basically. But of course, in a situation of war, people complaining about the secret police lose their credibility, don't they? Basically, the war on Syria has meant that the Mukhabarat, the secret police, is basically strengthened its hand for the next generation, basically, because people are very worried about the fact that, for example, in certain parts of the country, Syrians would, in the Yarmouk camp in Hama, for example, that people would invite in Jabhat al-Nusra, as good Muslims or whatever, and then their children would be killed as a result of people, traitors in their own midst. The people are worried about that, So if that doesn't re-legitimize a secret police, I don't know what does.
Well, I could go on and on about many things, about the chemical weapons attacks and white helmets and et cetera. There's so much more to talk about. I just want to bring Elizabeth in for a couple questions before we sign off.
Sure. No, I would open up the floor to that type of questioning as well. I think that's very interesting. I'd like to get Tim's thoughts on some of those things, but I'll, try to limit it just to one question, which is more, more relevant to recent events, and that is to return again to Tulsi Gabbard. And I just want to read a very small tweet thread that she published within the last 24 to 48 hours. She said, quote, "Trump to Kurds, I got you a great deal. I gave Turkey your homeland and homes, and you have 5 whole days to pack up your families and leave. Slaughter you. The art of the deal. How to sell what's not yours." And I wanted to get your response to that, Tim, and what are your thoughts on that take by Tulsi?
Well, the thing is, Tulsi is one of the best you've got in terms of this particular territory, but there is a language in US debate which is entirely to do with the US debate, and, calling people a brutal dictator and one thing and another. Right. It's something that sort of, to me, they're qualifiers. They qualify someone to enter the debate. If you don't use these cliches, you don't get into the debate there, basically. And I think that Tulsi was backed into a few corners to use those sorts of expressions. You know, I think that she genuinely saw some of the reality on the ground. I know there's that famous video of her with Christians in Aleppo, and the Christians giving her a perspective on what they think about the government, and the conflict and so on. So I think that she knows a bit better than that, basically. But, you know, in terms of the cliches that are used, and some people, I think, mistakenly on my side, on the anti-war side, and the people that support the resistance, wrongly criticise, say, for example, US journalists for using some of this language. I think it's just part of the territory, basically, you know, that, you know, so long as the US respects international norms, we don't really care what they say about the Syrians and their process, basically. You know,
but they don't respect international norms, and this
Yeah,
language
that's right.
being used leads to a diluted and totally misguided public about the important issues like Syria,
That's true.
where American troops are, for example, where American money is going, where sanctions are being imposed. So this is really important, the language, the political language in the U.S., I think. And it just props up some premises about America's good intentions, etc., covering up the real role America plays. So I wouldn't dismiss it so easily as that, but that's my opinion.
No, but I mean, I think what I'm getting at, there are some people who are very purist who say, well, you know, you haven't got it right because you're calling it a regime and because you're saying they're sensitive about going into certain areas and so on. I think people can be too exacting about those sorts of things. I think if people are on the right track, if they're saying that the US should withdraw there, the US should respect that it... Actually, the language of the UN Security Council, language of the Astana agreements is quite good. It's just that they aren't respecting that particular language, basically. So anyway, all I'm saying is that I don't use the language of US journalists because I'm not talking to that audience, generally speaking, basically. And I think that to be heard, there are some cliches about countries that have been, you know, there's been, 9 years of propaganda here. We can't underestimate the impact that has on people. And to get into the debate in the US, people, including Tulsi, have to use some of this sort of language.
Yeah, well, when you're talking about Democratic primary presidential, you know, candidates that are trying to vie for this nomination, I think that does go to, this is to borrow some of Joe's language, it goes to the unacknowledged third rails, and there are multiple of them, and we could get into that. That would be a whole other discussion, but I think that goes to what you're saying in a way.
Well, Tim, I wanted to thank you for being with us. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about your background in some quarters, particularly in the mainstream. Well, anyway, a lot of people we have on this show are controversial. Consortium News might be seen that way, but you have also a background where you were twice convicted for political violent crimes, but then one on appeal was overturned and then was pardoned another time after an inquiry. Could you just give a quick rundown of in your youth, were you committed to political violence?
No, I wasn't committed to political violence, but I was involved in political activities, and myself and two others were framed for a political violence back in the 70s. We spent 7 years in jail. I wrote a couple of books about it at the time. The last one's called Take Two, The Criminal Justice System Revisited. We were pardoned after an inquiry and paid compensation for wrongful imprisonment, and then they tried it a second time and I was acquitted. So there's a history there where I was deeply involved in prisoners' rights and civil rights activities. I became a civil rights activist in the 80s and 90s, basically. And then later on, I returned to my original interest, which was in international matters. But there is a history there, which I posted online. My book called Take Two deals with that.
But you still probably face a lot of opposition, even in Australia, as we do here, if you explain the war in the terms that we've been discussing it today, don't you?
Well, that's right. And it goes to the language question too, doesn't it? That if you are uncompromising in your language, then they will try and write you off and ignore you or attack you. I've been attacked many times by the corporate media here. And, you know, with abuse and with dishonest abuse, for example, because I don't really want to compromise the way that I talk about these sorts of things. I think it's important that someone is actually talking about the history. On the one hand, talking about the propaganda, the misinformation, also telling it to what's going on there. It's a very difficult thing to do, and I notice that journalists do have to qualify themselves to enter in certain debates, and if you are uncompromising about your language, they will ignore you. But I really have decided I don't really watch television. I don't read systematically the corporate media so much. I get my sources from a much wider range. There, I think it's important that there is some sort of stories being told that are rather uncompromising in the way that they treat these conflicts, these wars, this series of wars in the Middle East in particular.
Well, Tim Anderson, thank you very much for joining us on CN Live. It's been a really enlightening and interesting discussion about Syria. Maybe we'll have you back sometime as this war continues.